Hello, my name is Dave Lewis, and I am the host of Cinemallennials, a podcast where myself and another millennial watch a classic film that we haven't seen before, ranging from the early 1900s to the late 1960s, and discuss its significance and relevance in our world today. On today's episode, I talked with Eric McDonough, otherwise known as Conservative Film Buff on Twitter and Letterboxd. Eric picked 1928's The Passion of Joan of Arc, directed by Danish Francophile Carl Theodor Dreyer for the Société Générale de Film. Dreyer quite literally took his dialogue and scenery from the annals of history as he used the actual court minutes that were recorded by the inquisitors that put Joan of Arc to the stake in May of 1431. Fast-forwarding to 1927, Dreyer has immense pressure on him to create a masterpiece, as French nationalism was at its peak, and Joan was officially named as a saint by the Catholic Church only years earlier. And he did just that. The Passion of Joan of Arc is known for its slower but intense pacing, its revolutionary cinematography, the miraculous story of its survival as its lost negative was discovered in a mental institution in Norway, and of course, its reputation for containing the greatest acting performance ever recorded. The Passion of Joan of Arc follows the last days of Jeanne d'Arc, a French peasant girl that stated angels sent by God told her to unite and free France from English tyranny during the conflict we now know as the 100 Years' War. She accomplishes this through miraculously breaking the siege of Orleans, securing the coronation city of Reims, resulting in the coronation of King Charles VII, all by leading from the front as a teenage girl. She is eventually captured and ransomed to the English to be tried for heresy, and this is where the Passion of Joan of Arc begins. So sit back, relax, and don't sign any abjurations. Hey Eric, welcome to the show. What year were you born? What was the first film you saw in theaters? And what are your favorite films at the moment?
I was born in 1990, so I'm 30 years old. The first movie that I saw in theaters, I think, was Apollo 13. I have a really vague memory of it because that came out in maybe 94. So I would have been like 4 years old, and I remember that I fell asleep and I woke up during the end credits.
Oh, wow.
And then some of my favorite movies right now, not a lot of movies have come out this year, but definitely of the ones that have, I've seen The Vast of Night on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
And definitely recommend that one. It's kind of it's like a Twilight Zone episode.
Interesting.
And I think have you seen it yet?
No, I didn't even know about this movie, to be honest.
Yeah. Check out The Vast of Night on Amazon Prime. It's probably my favorite of the year so far. And then I also saw what recently came out, First Cow.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to see that. How was that?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, I'm not as passionate about it as Vast of Night, but it's really pretty good. It's very, very subtle. If you've ever seen any of Kelly Reichardt's films, they tend to be pretty subtle. Like, she leaves a lot of the action out, but the characters and the settings are really well done. So those are two from this year that I'd recommend, definitely.
Now, this is usually where I ask the guest about if they had any experiences with classic films, and that's what the majority of Eric does on Twitter. So how were you introduced to classic films, and why do you find yourself more drawn towards them rather than the new releases?
It's funny because I really didn't grow up watching classic movies, at least hardly ever. Unless you count the old Disney movies, I definitely saw those as a kid, which I would count those, but I never really saw black and white movies growing up. I came into it pretty much after I graduated high school. And when I was in college, I started watching old Disney movies with my girlfriend, who's now my wife. And we kind of started going through the old classic Disney movies, that golden era in the late 30s. And I'd never really looked at the Disney movies like chronologically or really thought much about them since I was a kid. So I was really interested in that and kind of learning about the different eras. And then from there, I just started watching more older movies, and I went to Hitchcock because he's one of the big names.
Right.
And then when I watched Hitchcock, I was pretty much blown away, and I was like, okay, this is what I like. I just kind of knew. It was almost like all through high school when I would watch movies, which I did watch a lot of movies in high school, but it was all newer stuff. it was like my taste was already formed before I even knew what it was. Because as soon as I saw that Hitchcock movie, and I think the first one I saw was The Man Who Knew Too Much, my girlfriend introduced me to it because she had seen it when she was younger because her dad is into old films. So we watched that together, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is what I love. so then I just started from there, just going through, and I just wanted to learn more. So I watched more Hitchcock, and I found other directors, and yeah, I mean, so the last 12 years, I've just kind of really taken to it.
You know, it's very hard to find people like us that like these classic films to a certain degree, especially within our generation.
Yeah.
And I think that it's kind of crazy, that stuff too, because like you're saying, you already had this idea of what your good film threshold was. Like you already had your thing where you're developing throughout your youth, and you're knowing what kind of tastes that you like, and you're developing that taste. And I think it's interesting with all the people that I've talked to so far, they're kind of realizing, because like I said before, you're the person that has the most experience with this stuff besides, you know, me and a couple other people that I know, where you have experience already watching these films, that you're saying that you already have this thing developed because everyone has this developed. They just don't know it because they're watching the films that were inspired by classic films and inspired by the techniques that these people developed over time through making these films earlier. So people don't know that and I keep saying this too, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and all like we do that, movies also do that as well. So I think a lot of what people need to really understand, really like know, is not to be intimidated by its black and white. There's not that much color, you know, don't think it's boring because of those things or the lack of those things. There is plenty of action. There's plenty of intense emotion behind these films that we see from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, not just things now. And especially with this film, there's so much emotional depth and spirituality and action within The Passion of Joan of Arc. What drew you to pick The Passion of Joan of Arc?
I love silent film, and funny enough, The Passion of Joan of Arc was one I had not seen, even though I consider myself a big silent film fan. I've even been to silent film festivals, but I had not seen that one, and I owned it even on Blu-ray. And so I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. I got to finally sit down and watch this, and you gave me the incentive to do that, so thank you.
Yeah, of course, man. I love this movie. Like you, sometimes I buy Criterion Collection movies. Like we talk about all the time on Twitter, where there's a Criterion sale. I was like, okay, good. Let me just get this thing now, watch it later. Yep. Like for people that don't know, Criterion Collection is this company that they restore and redistribute classic films that aren't in print anymore or are rarely in print, or, you know, just universal classics that a lot of people love, especially silent and other films of the earlier type of periods that, you know, are very hard to find, and they're very accessible that way. So what my first experiences with that was actually, I think it was me buying Henry V, Laurence Olivier's Henry V, because I love Shakespeare. I always love, you know, going into that period because I love medieval history and culture, and which is why this film popped out. So actually, I think the first 3 Criterion Collection films I bought were Henry V. I think I asked that for Christmas, Henry V. And then I think it was The Seventh Seal, which is another crazy influential film. And then I think it was The Passion of Joan of Arc. I knew a bunch of stuff about Joan of Arc and her story before that, but what did you know about Joan of Arc before watching the film? Did you know her story and her fate?
It's ridiculous how little I knew about Joan of Arc. I mean, I'm so glad I watched this because I just sort of knew this sort of vague idea of her being a hero back in the Middle Ages, and had never really looked into the details. And this taught me a lot, because after I watched the movie, I started reading about her. She's got a fascinating life.
She really does. It's amazing, her life. And I was reading somewhere that she actually has a longer paper trail as an illiterate peasant girl in the 15th century than the majority of kings in Europe during the Middle Ages. It's really down to the 2 trials she had. The first trial in May of 1431 with the Inquisitors, where she was tried on heresy, and then the second was 25 years later by Charles VII and his supporters that really wanted to exonerate and say, Joan of Arc is a saint and Joan of Arc is someone that was vital to our victory. This film is a great gateway into people that want to know about Joan and want to know about the history of her and who she was, and without kind of getting too in depth with it. Like, I think one of the best things about historical movies is that they are able to introduce people to a multi-layered and complex idea and story and history without getting into that stuff. And it brings people, like, I mean, this is from my personal experiences, that often if I want to know something about a certain period in history, I watch a film first and then get into the, meat and potatoes of what the actual history is. And I think The Passion of Joan of Arc is a perfect way to do that. Who were the characters and performances that stood out to you the most, and why?
Obviously, the main lead, Falconetti, she's incredible. And I knew her face well already just from exposure to film history.
Right.
And I think probably even a lot of people who don't know about the movie probably have seen as a still of her face because it's so powerful. And she does an incredible job. I mean, you can't help but empathize with her performance. And there was also a younger priest who really stood out to me. Do you know the one who sort of sympathizes with her and tries to get her to confess?
Yes.
The young one.
I think he's a very famous French actor and like poet. I can't remember his name at the top of my head, but one of the most amazing things about this film is that Dreyer adapted the trial notes from the notaries of the actual trial of Joan of Arc.
I can't believe that document still exists. That's just amazing.
It's really amazing that document is still around. The best performances, like you said, Falconetti is hands down the best performance in this film. And it's because of her. We're able to empathize with her so much because we can see every single detail of her face, and we can see what she's going through, what's going on in her mind, what's going on in her soul, the things that are just gripping and tearing her apart, because she has to defend herself for her life, because she feels that what she was doing was God's will. And how could the church be punishing her for listening to God and his angels and letting his will on earth and within France specifically be done? So she feels betrayed by this church and to a certain extent maybe betrayed by God, because why am I being punished for this? Why should I be punished when I did everything correctly? So another one of the things that is interesting when Dreyer is using the minute notes is that those minute notes might not be actually the true story of Joan. It was just that her, like, hey, I'm going to build this up, pad it up with more theological ideas rather than just telling the complete story, because she is defending herself for her life. Her life is on the line in this situation. And still at this point, she still wanted to fight, and she wanted to make sure the Burgundian side actually recognized her King Charles VII as the King of France, rather than having separate kingdoms and separate states. So I think it's really interesting to see the idea of close-ups. What did you think of the film's cinematography and the scenery surrounding our characters?
So the cinematography is by Rudolph Maté, who is a big name, and this film probably got him to that point where he was a big name. And it's incredible. You don't ever really see anything like it, even after the movie came out. There weren't a lot of films that copied it. There's not a lot of films from this period that did extreme close-ups like that. And I'd read that they had developed a new film stock to be able to get the detail in the face without having to use makeup. The faces are so well lit and so well recorded that you can see all the detail at a time when in silent movies, a lot of actors put really heavy makeup on, like think Charlie Chaplin. And it was not normal at the time to have actors not wearing makeup. And so that impressed me too, that Dreyer insisted that nobody wear makeup. And so I think that just like this stark black and white, no makeup, the backgrounds are very simple, not realistic at all, just simple, bare, stark. I think it really makes you even focus even more on the emotion of the performances.
Yeah, there's like no distractions behind behind the characters that we see. It's all very stark and very white and very, clean. There's not that many distractions at all, really.
Yeah, you don't. There are sets, but you don't even hardly see them that much because most every shot in the film is a close-up, or at least a medium shot.
And it's
So
funny, the Société des Films Généraux, the people that picked Dreyer to make the film, they were really mad about that you could barely see the set in the film because it cost 7 million francs to make. I don't know the actual, conversion, but it was a lot of money back then, back in 1928, and especially like, in our hindsight, right before the crash. But it's really interesting, and it's funny that you say that you thought it was kind of unrealistic, but Dreyer did massive amounts of research prior to filming this. And whether it be, about Joan's life, or they also looked at, for the architecture of the film, he refused to use plaster because it wasn't realistic for the time. He used concrete for all of the sets, and he also wanted to use concrete to mimic the tower that Joan was imprisoned in, which actually you can still visit today, which is amazing, especially with how people in the past just kind of took old materials and put it into their own house without regard of historical significance or whatever. But they also looked at medieval manuscripts from the time period, building the set with these different architectural things that medieval French people lived in. And it's really interesting to see because, as we know today, it depends on the production. There's not that much research in, like, there's always like a thing like within historical, circles and stuff that I follow on YouTube and different things like that people are always complaining, oh, the historical accuracy isn't there. And while it doesn't look like it's there because it is so stark white and stuff like that, one little detail that I really liked was that there's like graffiti on the walls of the prison, which I thought was really cool. If you look in the background with some shots, there's like a chicken-headed person spewing something out or something.
I noticed that,
And,
yeah.
Yeah, right? And what's great about that is that is such a hyper-focused detail within medieval world, because the medieval world was massively colorful and full of graffiti and art and hand-drawn things. And I mean, when you look at other films like The Seventh Seal, you see that stuff as well. So I really enjoyed the ideas that he put into this and the research that he put into this. And I think it's interesting when we're talking about the different angles and the shots that he decides to make. There's some crazy shots where, I mean, at the end where there's about to be a riot, he has the swinging of the camera in and out between the soldiers throwing out the morning stars and the flails to the other soldiers outside dealing with the crowd. And I think it's really interesting to see that, but also it's really cool to see that. And when you do a little bit of research about the film, he actually had to dig multiple spots throughout the set in order to get the low angle where we're seeing everything from Joan's perspective, while these guys, the clergy, are like higher up and they think they're higher up, in their mindsets. Whereas Joan thinks, I'm a lowly person, I hope to be in God's grace. And then compare it to when people talk about in film Orson Welles being the first person to show, ceilings, and he had to dig, things within the sets and stuff like that. And I think it's kind of crazy how Dreyer doesn't get that credit, but Orson Welles does. Why do you think that is?
That's true. It could be that people had a hard time seeing this movie for a long time.
Right.
And a lot of time, like when Citizen Kane came out, I don't think there was a good version of this movie available to see, if I'm not mistaken. And so a lot of those sayings like that Citizen Kane was the first movie to use such and such, a lot of that comes from the time of the movie, and it just keeps going on because it sounds good. And even if it's not true, so many people repeat it for so many years that I think it just sort of becomes the common saying. And then the research gets updated, but the saying doesn't,
Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right that there wasn't a good enough print at that time. And that was due to a massive fire that destroyed UFA Studios that housed Dreyer's original cut of the film, which led to the film being repieced together from reshoots Dreyer did. And even that disappeared after a while and was recut, making it not as available until a negative was found, miraculously, in an abandoned mental institution in Norway in 1981. When you're talking about these close-ups and low-angle shots for the majority of the film, do you feel that it made, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, did you feel that it made a stronger impact or an impact on you emotionally?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I don't think that with silent cinema, you're not getting so much the story a lot of the time, like for any silent movie. as much as you're getting imagery. And that's why a lot of people refer to silent cinema as pure cinema, because it's focused on the image and the cutting. And Dreyer's choices are so deliberate and so unusual that you can't help but just really feel it, because it's not something you're used to seeing. When you see the low angles and the odd framing, like sometimes the faces are framed where they're down in one corner of the shot. And I think that the way that he did that makes you sort of feel their headspace more. It feels more like subjective filmmaking rather than objective. You're not just watching this movie to get the story of Joan of Arc. You're watching it to feel what she felt.
Exactly.
And absolutely, I think that he was extremely effective in doing that.
And it's really interesting to see, because when you look at this film from a historical perspective, and when you look at it from what people felt at the time, a lot of people were absolutely against him directing this film. And while because he was a massive Francophile, which he was a massive person of French history and culture, and he respected this, but at the same time, he was an atheist. And prior to the film being even made, or even being a concept of being made in 1920, 8 years earlier, Joan was officially canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church. So there was a lot of big, heavy emotions surrounding the making of this film. There was even a rumor that a very famous silent film actress from America, she's probably one of the biggest silent film actresses of all time, and very early on, Lillian Gish was going to star instead of Falconetti. So it's kind of interesting to see where people had this idea of where, oh, can he really adapt this great nationalist story of Joan of Arc, our Catholic saint, when he was a Danish man and was a atheist? And I think even after that, some people were a little bit, I mean, the Catholic Church to a certain degree also kind of acted like their ancestors in this situation in France, where they made him cut a couple things. He understood the religious emotions and understood the emotions and psychology of what Joan was going through without that background of the theological ideas or the spiritual ideas that she might have felt. He has this immense emotional intelligence to understand what she's going through and to take that out of Falconetti. He was a notoriously tough director to work with, in that at one point, this film really impacted Falconetti. This was the last film she made. She made one before this, but that film is unfortunately lost. And with how she treated her and the whole arduous journey of it, what he did was he shot every single scene in order. Throughout the filming, he would have Falconetti on her knees on hours on end on concrete. He would also have her shackled up at some points. And at the beginning, even before that, when he was looking for actors, he was like, she's originally a comedy stage actress and was very highly regarded in France. And then he saw her one time, I was like, I'm not sure. And then the second time, he's like, wait, there is something behind this facade, behind the makeup, behind the comedy that I could really pull out of her and to show her as the real Joan. Because throughout the film, like you said, emotionally and psychologically, you can almost feel her presence in Falconetti.
Definitely.
And it's something like so ethereal and eerie at times, because you, as we keep saying, the idea of getting their emotions across is the most important thing with silent film, because you don't have the inclinations and the things behind what we say. We just have visuals. We have, the face is the canvas in silent film. Do you think the combination of being in a similar setting as to how I kind of described and how they were looking at the medieval manuscripts to the real people the film is based on, and the majority of the film being shot up close, made the actors want to give their best performances?
Yeah, definitely. I think even if we don't see a whole lot of the set, at least not for extended periods of time, I think that the knowledge that they had spent so much on it and put so much into it probably affected the actors quite a bit, because they're the ones who are in that space. And I think that the starkness of it probably made them feel separated from their modern lives too. Like as soon as you enter that set, I can imagine the impact that would have on you. I do wonder about that. I wonder if it was more Dreyer just sort of pushing and pushing and pushing, because I know he's notorious for doing so many takes. Or
Yeah,
if it was,
he's like one of the first directors to do like reshoots. Like we know as reshoots, ooh, reshoots are bad today. Like, that whole
yeah,
idea. But he
uh-huh.
was, I mean, that even helped save the film for a time.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. He was like Kubrick before Kubrick. because
Exactly.
because I think that the actors kind of got sick and tired of him, from what I've read too, because he
Mhm.
just had them do so many takes. And I wonder if it was I mean, it's probably a combination of the environment that they had created and the attention to detail on the clothing and everything else, and then also just Dreyer just pushing them the way that he did, that was able to get these performances that have definitely lived on.
Yeah, and it's funny that you're talking about that. I forgot to mention that all of the monks that you see in this film had to get their haircuts in tonsures, which is the archetypal haircut of a monk where you have fringe on the outside and the bald spot in the middle.
Right. So they couldn't
And
just do a bald cap then.
yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
he was like, no, everything has to be as realistic as possible because, and I think that's good, and you see that a lot today, where somewhat so where people within acting themselves, we have everyone knows about method acting, and I think really, and then when you look at new storytelling methods, where you have VR, where you have the idea of on the Mandalorian set, if you saw that Disney documentary about it, where the whole surrounding is all screens and it has like actual like pictures and video of these surroundings, but it's all in a studio. So, and the actors
Right.
within that said that everything felt so realistic and so natural as a part of that because you're able to immerse yourself into the story, into the settings, and that makes a major effect on your brain because you are there. You're living there, you're breathing there, you're eating there. You're doing all these action moments in the film. And I think that's really, revolutionary for the time where he wanted to make it feel as if they were actually in that time period, as if they were actually those people. And you could definitely tell from the performances because, and I'm sure there was outside influence as well, too, because a lot of these actors are French. And with the recent history, they wanted to do the best they could possibly do. But I think even that, them being in that environment makes them feel that way and makes them want to be that way because they want it to be a lot of the things with acting and performances in general is about living out the truth. And they wanted to portray that truth in this film because it was so important to the French people and to the national state as a whole, as well as, the Catholic Church and how it was seen as a story where, condemnation and then bringing it back to redemption in that way. Dreyer himself in the writing of the film even furthers that immersion as using the minutes as his framework alongside the use of Christ-like imagery. He wrote an allegory, which is one of the most influential and most popular things that come from the Middle Ages in literature. And did you feel that Dreyer was trying to be allegorical with his use of the crown Joan is making, the mocking from the soldiers, the temptation of Joan by the sneaky priest, the grime and worm tongue of this situation, as he's trying to use wiles, he says, or was he just trying to use what was on the record?
Oh, he's absolutely trying to connect your mind to the Passion of Christ. Absolutely. Throughout the whole thing, there's connections to the Christ trial. And I mean, a lot of things stuck out to me. Like, for example, there's a time when they ask her to hold a cross while she's walking from the building to the stake to be burned. And it's like the stages of the cross traditionally, right? Where, it's like she's even carrying her cross to be dead. And then and while she's being burned, she's looking at a cross as well. And I think she says even at one point, "May I be with you in paradise."
Right.
And the whole time, and it's like this the whole movie, you're supposed to be connecting the dots and saying, this is like when Christ went through that, and she is going through a similar thing. And the thing that I kind of got out of that was that you're supposed to empathize with her, because no matter if you're Catholic or not, if you're a Christian, you're going to know about Christ's death. And perhaps that was a way for Dreyer to sort of make you see Joan of Arc in a new light.
Right.
Just like, if you're not Catholic, if you don't know about her being a saint or whatever, at least when you're seeing this, you can see a Christ-like figure in her. You can see someone who was persecuted unfairly, was killed unfairly, and who definitely believed that she was receiving visions, that she could talk with God in the same way that Christ did. And you could connect those dots and say, well, yeah, it was wrong for Christ to be killed, and it was wrong for her to be killed in the same way. And also, I think he connects the priests to the Pharisees. And you're supposed to see those the same way too. You're supposed to see them as religious figures, but they're corrupt. They're not seeing things the way they should. And this sort of humble person who comes from outside of the priesthood is there to teach them something. That they don't know everything. This humble person who speaks with God can teach them.
Right. And the first time watching this film a couple years ago, you know, I saw that but didn't realize it until now. And, you know, I mean, I'm Christian. You know, I often find a part of my fascination with the medieval period is how, you know, those people felt so strongly towards their faith. But I think there is such a beauty to how he does it. Whereas there's films even later that kind of do it very clunkily. I know it's very obvious in this film that he's trying to do that to some people, but I think the way he is able to do it is so beautiful and so well exhibited throughout this whole film.
I think that you could make an argument that it's too obvious, but I just think the way he does it, I totally agree. I wasn't sitting there saying, "Oh, come on, that's so obvious."
Right.
Because it's just so beautifully done.
I keep saying this is because of how he's able to capture every single emotion that Joan is going through. It is a very biased movie because we are clearly supposed to be empathizing with Joan and her ideas and her massive influence on the French national culture. And the way that we get it from this is that it's all through the emotions. It's not through historical facts. It's not through like preconceived ideas of what people know about Joan. All it is based on the emotions and the truth of those emotions, and some of those emotions that people still feel today, especially now. I think we kind of mentioned earlier with the younger priests. Throughout this idea of the younger priests wanting to go out and outwardly and at least support Joan throughout the whole trial. Like the one priest we were saying earlier, they're like, at one point he interrupts the trial and he's like, do you understand like how dangerous that answer is? Like, you understand that, right? Like, he's trying to say like, hey, don't say that stuff because, you know, you're going to die from this. And we want you to be around. We want you to perform miracles. We want you to stay alive, to stay with us in order to take the shackles off, if you will, and free France from English rule. Do you think that within this, because Joan was a massively political figure at the time,
right? Of course.
Do you think that within the priests, so you have the priests that are the younger priests that are against putting Joan to death and are empathizing with her, and then you have the major priest that's like, she has to die, she's a heretic, and then you have the priest that's in between. Do you feel that this is almost like a commentary on generational gaps between governments, like how government should be used in a way to, you know, suppress different ideas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I kind of had to think about it. I could almost think that, I mean, this came out at such a revolutionary time, especially in world history too. I could almost think that there is kind of a commentary on the young versus the old throughout the movie. I mean, the fact that Joan was 19 is a big deal, and most of her persecutors are old men. Because like you said, the younger priests are there, but they're kind of reluctant, and they want to help her. And yeah, I think you could make a commentary. I hadn't really quite thought of it that way, but you could say that one of the things being presented in the movie is that a lot of times the young people have a lot of things to teach the old establishment, if you will, the authority figures. The older ones were the ones who had the ugliest faces, and they were making the most frowns, and the younger ones were more like empathetic to her. And then she herself being young is maybe part of the commentary of the film, that, you know, this young person takes on these old establishment types. And then when you think of the the setting of when this movie came out and all the revolutions that were happening all over the world and had been happening. I think that fits right into the kind of stuff that was going on in the world.
Right. There's so many things going on where you have, you know, kind of similar to what we're basically just like repeating history today to a certain degree.
Yep.
And I think like part of it with this stuff as well is with the older priests' reactions and the younger priests' reactions to after Joan says, okay, I'm going to recant and sign this. I think it's interesting. They go from having a preconceived notion to kind of believing what Joan says, and they kind of feel bad for her at this point, and they have a lot of pity for her or pity on her. Do you feel this pity as genuine? Like part of it feels like they're trying to say like, oh, we want to protect you, and it's kind of slimy and scaly that they're trying to do that. But for some of them, like, I mean, one of the examples that I remember seeing is bigger, the heavier priest at the beginning is all robust and bombarding about how she's a heretic and how she's a terrible person and all this other stuff, so much so that he gets such a frenzy that he spits in her face.
Right.
And
yeah.
At the end, he's crying and he's feeling her pain. Part of me, like the idea of, like we both said earlier, about the Pharisees. Do you feel like that it's genuine, or do you feel like it's like, oh, wow, wait, are we actually, you know, are we the Pharisees and let's try to, like, you know, for posterity, let's be good about this. Let's say, oh, we feel bad about Joan.
Yeah, I think there's something to that because, I mean, you brought this up, but they're a lot meaner in the first half of the movie. Yeah, you don't see when she's being killed, you don't see a lot of people or a lot of the priests laughing about it or anything like that.
Right.
They're not happy they have to kill her, but I think they sort of saw it as their duty, and that could maybe tie into that anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment sentiment in the movie, because if you're part of the old way of thinking, or then you're going to have to do a lot of things that are wrong, and these young idealistic people like Joan or like the priests who are sympathetic to her, you know, they have this moral clarity to them that they don't have to be part of this system that does so many bad things. And maybe you're supposed to kind of see the older people and think, well, gosh, I don't want to be like them because they're not happy with themselves.
They're priests, and these are doctors of theological ideas and, you know, the history of the religion and everything like that. And it's like, part of it is like, can you really tell if they actually feel bad and actually realized, oh, wait a second, hold on. We're not doing what Christ said to do. We are the Pharisees. We are understanding now, within halfway through that, you know, I mean, more than halfway through the trial, that, oh, wow, we're actually putting her to death and basically making her as a Christ-like example. And we're the ones that are being the Pharisees. And I think it's like really interesting to see the two sides of the coin, like we keep saying, with the young and old priests. And I think it's kind of, sometimes I think as you get older, if you're a Christian or if you, whatever religion, you know, there's always that kind of doubt in there. And I'm sure parts Joan had these kind of doubts about who these voices were and who were the things that she saw to a certain degree. But it's like, it's interesting to see their reactions pre and post actually talking to Joan and seeing what her actions are, what her answers are as a whole. And I think we keep kind of talking about this. What themes within the film do you feel are most applicable to the time period we are living in today?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, it's a movie about humanity and human emotions. And in fact, as we've been talking, I've kind of been rethinking the whole notion of the youthful rebel versus the old establishment type. Because I think you could read that out of the movie, but I do wonder how much of that is actually intentional. I mean, I'd have to watch the movie again, and I wonder how much if you're supposed to see like a political thing in it like that, or if it's just supposed to be just humanity. Because when you were talking about how the priests were doubting themselves, you know, that just kind of made me think, you know, maybe what we're supposed to get out of this is that we're not supposed to think of it politically. We're just supposed to think, what would I do in this situation? And
Right.
maybe it's just the different kinds of priests cover the different spectrum of human emotion, and maybe you're supposed to see yourself in the different characters. I think you can
Right.
interpret it multiple ways.
Oh yeah, I think that's one of the most beautiful things about this film is that it's so open and so, open to interpretation. And I think part of it is multi-layered where you can definitely look at it through both of these things. And I didn't even realize until I started writing these questions. I was like, wait a second, hold on a minute. I didn't even think about this because, as me, like as a Christian, as somebody that, knows a story and does a lot of research about Christianity in general and
Mm-hmm.
its beginnings, its end, like, where we are now, it's really interesting to see how an atheist, I mean, not that, you have to know every single thing about Christianity through being a Christian yourself. But it's amazing to see that how he understands a lot of the implications behind being Christian, implications, with and consequences with it, having taken specific moral responsibilities and stuff like that too. And I think it's really interesting to see like what you were saying. And I think that's how I initially came to this film was that you're supposed to be, or Dreyer's trying to say, hey, look at this situation Joan is in that she is almost Christ-like in her way, and she's choosing to be Christ-like because she feels that she is, she feels that, I mean, at the end, she recants her recantation because
Right.
she feels that if she doesn't make this sacrifice, that nothing will be accomplished, and she will actually, regret that she tried to make a stand and ended up not putting that stand all the way through, which is partly, I think, in the end, now that I'm thinking about this, it's kind of the way that the priests were thinking as well, too, because kind of hard to determine, do they actually feel pity on her or not? Part of it's like, okay, now when they hear the news that Joan actually recants her recantation, they're like, well, now we have to go through with it because otherwise we're going to be called out.
Right.
It's oh, are we actually, committed to this duty? Are we actually committed to this idea that what we've put out there, or were we just doing it performative to make sure the idea of what we are about is still there?
Doesn't it make you think a little bit of Herod having to kill John the Baptist?
Yeah, 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 it
Because he
does.
really didn't want to, because the people saw John the Baptist as a prophet,
Right.
and but he made a promise, and as soon as he did that, then when his daughter-in-law requested that he bring the head of John the Baptist, he was like, oh, oops.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to that, isn't it?
Like you're saying, we always keep saying about how empathy, and I think that's a lot of things that, people often miss about our society today is that there's not a lot of empathy. People, you want to be put in other people's shoes to a certain extent and try to see the humanity of that person rather than, seeing a side to something. Or it's interesting to see Dreyer, who was notably strict and tough, as we learned in the past, like what we were talking about earlier with, Falconetti being on concrete, kneeling on concrete for 5 hours. And it's kind of hard to see, like, him trying to say, hey, you got to be empathetic. But I think it's really interesting to see that it is so multifaceted and so you can interpret it in so many ways.
Yeah, I think that comes with it, just trying to stick with universal human emotion.
Right.
I wish more movies would do that. I wish we
Yes.
wouldn't see such overt politics in so many movies like we do. Because I think the more universal you make it, and this movie's about as universal as you can get, because it's just
Right.
so subjective. Yeah, I think the more you're going to have a wider audience for it, and the more it's going to last, like this movie, which will be 100 years old soon. When filmmakers strive for that kind of universality, I think they do everyone a favor.
There's a lot of things with politics in movies, and it depends on who's directing and who's not. And I think throughout there's always something that could be said and that there should be said in films, and there's almost always some little political element. And people, like we
Yeah.
said, it's so universal that people can take ideas from different things.
Yeah.
And I think
even I took a political idea from it too. Earlier we were talking about the revolutionaries versus the establishment. You can get so many things out of it. You can make it political if you want to, but it doesn't have to be.
That's, like we keep saying, it's the beauty of the film, and it's the beauty of Dreyer having us be in this seat in this film, saying, okay, while it is all about Joan, we do have to look at a little bit of what the priests are feeling too, because Joan is the most empathetic character. I was watching with my mom, like she watched like the last like 40 minutes of it, because it is, the whole film, like the idea of that, like, and everybody's felt this at some point with a film, where you get into that zone where you don't care about anything else but what's on screen. Because with this film, it's so easy to do that. It's so easy because
it really
it's so focused, and it's so without distraction completely. And yes, while it is a little slower, that's the point of it being slower. And I think that it's just so fascinating. And I think it is super modern. It is such a modern film that there's so many things that come from this movie that we can see, while there were, like, people don't really catch up on the super extreme close-ups that they have, but it's still making an impact. And what I was trying to think of movies that are close to this film, like in the zone type of feeling, in the way that it's conveying certain emotions and things like that. And I think one of the major films that have come out recently, or major film directors that have been working recently, is Terrence Malick. I think, a lot of his stuff, especially the spiritual sides of a lot of things with close-ups and wider spectrums of psychologies and ideas, especially within religious experiences, I think there are massive amounts of Dreyer within Malick's films. Like, one of my most recent films that I absolutely adored was A Hidden Life, which came out last year and almost no one saw, which was really disappointing to me.
That was the last movie I saw in theaters.
And you could see it's a different story and set in a different time, but in a lot of ways it's the same story of Joan.
Right. It's pretty similar, isn't it, that movie?
Not only because of the story of who Franz Jägerstätter was, but and his beliefs being similar to Joan's. It's a farm person. It's someone, living a simple life, that has this immense faith and immense emotional attachment to their faith, like Joan, making an impact, even though it could be small. And later on, it grows and grows, becoming a bigger impact. Another film that would be a good double feature would be The Passion of Joan of Arc and Silence, Martin Scorsese's Silence, because they're very close in ideas, but different endings and different philosophical endings.
That'd be great. Yeah, I like that idea. I like Silence more than A Hidden Life. I wasn't real big on A Hidden Life, but that's more of a stylistic thing for me. I'm not crazy about Malick's style.
Not many people are crazy.
It's kind of similar to what Dreyer does, but I feel like Malick's use of montage is like so constant that I can't breathe. Like, I need something to ground it,
Right.
Because the whole movie is just a montage, and that's how he always is. But Silence is one of my favorite Scorsese movies.
Same.
And the treatment of a religious life and the kind of sacrifices that you have to go through in a place that's hostile to you for having that inner life.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting comparison. Very interesting, because in that movie it's more like they have to sort of find a way to cope.
Mm-hmm.
And here there is no coping. It's just you either have to change or you're going to die. And that's an interesting comparison between those two. That would be a good double feature.
I think it like mainly what I was thinking was, and I'm not going to give away silent spoilers, but because of how that film ends and how Rodriguez starts the beginning of the film with a certain idea and because he would probably at the beginning of the film most likely be on the side of the priests and the clergy that are judging Joan, rather than where he is at the end of the film. He he makes a massive change because of Liam Neeson's character and what he does and how he convinces him to believe in certain ideas with Jesus's ideas about mercy. And I think it would just be a really interesting contrast between the two, as well as being something that's very similar ideas in a very similar kind of way. And I'm almost thinking about going back and watching that film. It would be so fascinating to look at that and like to look at that to see if there are any Dreyer or the Passion of Joan of Arc influences on that film. But to end this conversation, why do you think millennials and younger generations should watch The Passion of Joan of Arc?
I think it's just good for people to be exposed to something that's far removed from them, and then yet, especially with this film, to be able to feel the human emotion from it. I mean, we already said this is getting close to 100 years old. In a few years, it'll be 100 years old, and the style of the filmmaking feels fresh still. It feels new because not a lot of people have copied it. The acting is not how actors would do it today. It's more of that more kind of like miming that they did in the silent film days. But the performances still make you feel something. The images are still powerful, and the humanity of the people who made this movie is still, you can still relate to it. I think it's good for somebody to look back at a different era, and especially consider that this movie was, focused on a story that's hundreds of years old, and be able to relate to that. It's good for people to learn history that way, and it's good for people to experience empathy in that way, like somebody that's so far removed from you, and yet you can feel and maybe even deeply feel a connection to that. That's a pretty cool thing, especially for young people.
Two versions, or actually there's technically three versions of the film that you could watch. I myself prefer the 20 frames per second and the Yoshida soundtrack, which is the piano soundtrack. And Eric initially watched which one did you watch, Eric?
I started with the 24 frames per second one, which is a little bit faster.
Right.
And I heard the Voices of Light score on it, which is a choral piece that was written inspired by the movie. And then I actually went back and watched the 20 frames per second with the piano score. I don't think you can go wrong with either one of those. I think,
right.
Since we're gearing toward millennials and younger people, maybe some of them haven't seen silent films.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't, I think I would recommend the 24 frame per second with the choral score. For the reason that it has a little bit more punch to it. It's a little bit faster paced, because the movie's made up of so many shots of people's faces that if it's a little bit slower, you might not get into it as well. You know what I mean? If you're not used to it.
Right.
So I might recommend the 24 frames if you're new to it, but that's just my opinion. Don't watch the one without a score. I never recommend that.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have been seen that way originally.
Exactly. Like I saw somewhere where they're like, he didn't want a score, but it's like that's not accurate. Like, yeah. And I said this in another podcast that throughout, silent films, they had somebody playing, like they had an accompanist playing the music or playing, if like Dreyer didn't have an original score, or, they just said, pick whatever you want, whatever's appropriate, then they would play that. And I think that's really interesting to say, because it's such a contrast of how we have, composers like John Williams, Hans Zimmer, and, stuff like that, making things before the films come out. It's really interesting.
Right. Yeah. Silent film's a whole different medium, really. It's almost a different art form.
Yeah.
Because you could mess with the speed of the footage and everything. And the piano score is really good. I thought that the pianist did an amazing job. And if you want a little flavor of how it might have been to be in a normal theater at the time, watching someone playing accompaniment with a piano, which is what most theaters would have been doing, a piano or an organ, then you've got that version. And if you want to feel like you're more at the premiere of the movie, which would have had a big orchestra, then you've got your orchestra Voices of Light version. So you can take your pick. Yeah, it's cool that they did that.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like, I mean, because I think I initially watched it with Voices of Light, and it definitely feels like you're in this monastery type of medieval mindset where you're listening to these amazing choral pieces. And I think it's really cool. But part of why I wanted to watch it with the 20 FPS, which is frames per second, and as Eric basically kind of touched on, where you were able to manipulate the speed of the camera, because, and I talked about this before in the Man Who Laughs episode, which, Eric, if you haven't seen that one, great movie.
Okay.
It is it's hand cranking. So the cinematographer is making the camera move. You know, it depends on how fast or how slow you want to go. And there is an essay on that. And there's a visual essay or an audio essay on the Criterion DVD Blu-ray as well, where it talks about, hey, these are the arguments as to why or why not you should watch the 24 FPS, why watch the 20 FPS, and it gives you a decision. And I mean, Eric watched it twice. It is a film that has, and it warrants multiple viewings of
yeah.
It's every time I come back to this movie, I find something new and something different and something unique about it. And it just overall, I do consider this to be one of the greatest films of all time, not only because of the performance, but for all the different reasons that we talked about today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think no matter the version you watch, as long as it's not the one that doesn't have any accompaniment, because if you're new to silent film, you're probably not going to like that. I think you can't go wrong, because I think that there's not a huge difference between the 24 FPS and the 20 FPS if you're just watching them. You don't notice it immensely, and I don't think you're going to feel that you've missed out if you see one versus the other. So just see it however you can, and it's an amazing film.
I really hope you enjoyed today's discussion I had with Eric about one of the greatest films and performances ever caught on camera, The Passion of Joan of Arc. I'd like to thank Eric for taking some time out of his day to talk with a complete stranger that follows him on Twitter about this film and to give his perspectives on it. He and his wife also have a podcast called The Movie Shelf that you should also check out. If you enjoyed this episode of Cinemallennials and want to watch the film we discussed, please check out my website, dlumoviereview.com, for more episodes of the podcast, film reviews, analyses, and where to purchase the film we discussed today. Please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and give us a rating, as it helps more people find the podcast. Thank you.